What if I told you that the man who became the world's most wanted terrorist started life as a privileged millionaire's son who studied economics and management? What if I told you his path to radicalization began not in some cave, but in the hallowed halls of a prestigious university? Today we're diving deep into one of the most complex and controversial figures of the 21st century. A story that spans from the skyscrapers of Saudi Arabia to the mountains of Afghanistan, from luxury to hiding in compounds. This is the complete, unfiltered history of Osama bin Laden. But before we start, if you're interested in more deep-dive historical content like this, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's rewind to 1957. Elvis is dominating the charts, the space race is heating up, and in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a boy named Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden is born into unimaginable wealth. Now, when I say wealthy, I don't mean my dad owns a car dealership wealthy. I mean my dad literally built half of Saudi Arabia wealthy. Mohammed bin Laden, Osama's father, was the construction mogul of the kingdom. We're talking about the guy who renovated the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina, the Saudi royal family's go-to builder. This man had connections that would make a LinkedIn influencer weep. Here's where it gets interesting. Mohammed bin Laden had 54 children. Yes, you heard that right, 54. Dude was busier than a TikTok content creator. Osama was child number 17, born to Mohammed's 10th wife, a Syrian woman named Hamida al-Attas. But here's the plot twist that sounds like it's straight out of a drama series. When Osama was just 10 years old, his father died in a plane crash. Suddenly, this kid who was already somewhat of an outsider in this massive family empire inherited millions, but also became even more isolated. Picture this. You're a preteen with more money than most people see in a lifetime, but you're also dealing with the loss of your father and trying to find your place in a family that could populate a small town. It's like being the main character in the world's most twisted coming-of-age story. Fast forward to the mid-1970s. Osama is now in his late teens, standing 6'4" tall, basically a Saudi Arabian basketball prospect, and he's heading to King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah to study economics and business administration. Now, you might think, great, he's getting a solid education, maybe he'll join the family business, everything will be normal. Nope. This is where the story takes its first dark turn. At university, Osama encounters two professors who would fundamentally change his worldview, Mohammed Qutb and Abdullah Azzam. These names might not mean much to you now, but stick with me, they're about to become very important. Mohammed Qutb was the brother of Sayyid Qutb, often called the father of modern jihadist ideology. Imagine if your economics professor casually dropped radical political theories alongside supply and demand curves. That's essentially what happened here. But it was Abdullah Azzam who really lit the fuse. This Palestinian scholar became Osama's mentor and introduced him to the idea that Muslims had a religious duty to fight against what he saw as Western oppression and the occupation of Muslim lands. Here's what's crazy. While his classmates were probably worried about exams and dating, Osama was becoming increasingly obsessed with global politics and religious ideology. He started growing out his beard, becoming more conservative, and, this is important, he began to see wealth not as something to enjoy, but as a tool for a greater purpose. By 1979, two massive events would set the stage for everything that followed: the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution. For young Osama, these weren't just news headlines, they were a call to action. So here we are in 1979. The Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan and the world is watching. But while most people are following this conflict on TV, our 22-year-old millionaire's son decides, you know what, I'm going to personally get involved in this. And this is where Osama's story gets absolutely wild. Using his family connections and personal wealth, he started funneling money to the Afghan Mujahideen, the fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. But he didn't just write checks from his air-conditioned office in Saudi Arabia. No, this guy actually traveled to Pakistan and Afghanistan to see the situation firsthand. Picture this scene: a tall, soft-spoken Saudi millionaire showing up in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan trying to help coordinate resistance against one of the world's superpowers. It sounds like the setup for the world's most unlikely action movie. But here's where it gets even crazier. The CIA was also supporting the Mujahideen through a program called Operation Cyclone. So, indirectly, American tax dollars were flowing to some of the same groups that Osama was funding. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. During this period, Osama wasn't just throwing money around, he was learning about guerrilla warfare, about organizing cells, about moving money without being traced. He was basically getting a master's class in international terrorism, except nobody realized it at the time. His mentor Abdullah Azam had moved to Pakistan to coordinate support for the Afghan fighters, and Osama followed. Together, they established something called the Maktab al-Khidmat, basically a service bureau that recruited, trained, and funded foreign fighters coming to join the Afghan resistance. Think of it as a combination travel agency, military recruitment office, and charity organization, except instead of booking beach vacations, they were organizing holy war.
But here's the key detail that everyone missed at the time. Osama was keeping detailed records of everyone who came through their system. Names, addresses, skills, contacts. He was essentially building a database of international fighters, what would later become the foundation of something much more sinister. The Afghan war lasted a decade, and by the time the Soviets withdrew in 1989, Osama had transformed from a rich kid with radical ideas into a battle-tested organizer with international connections and a proven track record of successful operations. The Mujahideen had won, the mighty Soviet Empire had been defeated, and Osama bin Laden had been part of making it happen. But now what? You've got thousands of trained fighters, vast networks, weapons, and experience. The war that had given their lives meaning was over. This is what experts call the successful jihad problem. What do you do with all these resources when your original mission is complete? For many fighters, the answer was simple: go home. But for Osama and his closest associates, the answer was different: find a new war. August 11, 1988. While most people were probably watching the Olympics or enjoying their summer vacations, Osama bin Laden was sitting in a house in Peshawar, Pakistan, having a meeting that would change world history. This was the day Al-Qaeda was officially founded, though they didn't call it that initially. The Arabic word qaida means base or foundation, and that's exactly what they were creating, a foundation for global jihad. But here's what's fascinating. The meeting minutes from that day actually survived. Yes, you heard that right. These guys kept meeting minutes like they were starting a book club instead of a terrorist organization. Talk about bureaucratic terrorists. The original idea was surprisingly corporate in structure. They wanted to create what we might call a franchise model for jihad, a central organization that could support and coordinate various local groups fighting what they saw as enemies of Islam around the world. Osama's role was essentially CEO and primary investor. He was funding the operation, but he was also learning from other participants who had different skills: military tactics, religious scholarship, organizational management. It was like a terrorist MBA program. But then came 1990, and everything changed. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and suddenly there were non-Muslim foreign troops, specifically American troops, stationed in Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's two holiest cities. For Osama, this was the ultimate betrayal by his own government. Here's a guy who had just spent a decade fighting foreign occupation of Muslim lands in Afghanistan, and now his own country was inviting in foreign troops. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. He actually approached the Saudi government with a proposal. Hey, let me use my Mujahideen fighters to defend the kingdom instead of bringing in American troops. The Saudi response was essentially, thanks, but no thanks, we'll stick with the professionals. This rejection wasn't just a political disagreement for Osama, it was a personal and religious crisis. He had grown up believing in the righteousness of the Saudi system, had made his fortune within it, and had spent years fighting to defend Muslim lands. Now, in his view, that same system was betraying everything he held sacred. So he did what any dramatically inclined millionaire with a private army would do: he went into exile. First, Sudan, where the government actually welcomed him with open arms. The Sudanese saw an opportunity. Here was a guy with millions of dollars, international connections, and a proven ability to get things done. They offered him citizenship and basically gave him free rein to operate. For several years, Osama lived quite comfortably in Sudan. He invested in businesses, built infrastructure projects, and continued developing his network. But he was also planning something much bigger. February 23, 1998. While most Americans were probably following the Monica Lewinsky scandal or watching Titanic for the 100th time, Osama bin Laden issued a document that would define the next chapter of world history: his declaration of war against Jews and Crusaders. But let's back up a bit, because the road to this declaration is a masterclass in how personal grievances can escalate into global terrorism. By the mid-1990s, international pressure had forced Sudan to expel Osama. He had become too much of a liability, too high profile, too connected to various terrorist incidents. So, where do you go when you're a stateless millionaire terrorist? Back to Afghanistan, of course, where his old Mujahideen contacts were now running things under a new name, the Taliban. The Taliban welcomed him like a returning hero. Here was the guy who had helped defeat the Soviets, and now he was bringing money, expertise, and international fighters to help consolidate their control over Afghanistan. But Osama wasn't content to just settle down and throw retirement in the mountains. He was thinking bigger, much bigger. The 1998 declaration wasn't just a random outburst of anger. It was a carefully crafted document that laid out a comprehensive worldview and strategy. In it, Osama argued that America had declared war on Islam through its foreign policy, particularly its support for Israel and its military presence in Saudi Arabia. His logic went something like this: if America is going to treat this as a war, then we'll give them a war. And since they target civilians in Muslim countries through their policies, civilian Americans are legitimate targets. It's twisted logic, but it's important to understand because it shows how Osama had evolved from someone fighting specific local conflicts to someone advocating for global terrorism against civilians.
The declaration also announced the formation of the World Islamic Front for Jihad against Jews and Crusaders, basically a terrorist supergroup bringing together Al-Qaeda with other extremist organizations from around the world. But here's what's really chilling. The declaration didn't just threaten future attacks. It explicitly called for the killing of Americans and their allies, both military and civilian, wherever they could be found. Most people in the West had never heard of Osama bin Laden at this point. He was just another Middle Eastern extremist making threats. But intelligence agencies were starting to pay attention because they were seeing increased chatter about potential attacks. And Osama wasn't just making empty threats. He was already putting his money where his mouth was, literally. August 7, 1998. It was a Friday morning in East Africa, and most people were starting their weekend or heading to prayers. But at exactly 10:35 a.m. local time, two massive truck bombs exploded almost simultaneously at the US embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The coordination required for these attacks was unprecedented. We're talking about operations that required months of planning, precise timing across different time zones, and operational security that kept the plans hidden from multiple intelligence agencies. In Nairobi, the explosion was so powerful that it destroyed not just the embassy, but damaged buildings over a mile away. The final death toll was staggering. 224 people killed, including 12 Americans, and over 4,000 wounded. Most of the victims were local civilians who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was Osama's international debut as a terrorist, and it announced his arrival on the world stage with devastating clarity. The FBI investigation that followed was like something out of a detective novel, except the stakes were global security. They traced the trucks, the explosives, the financial networks, and the communication patterns. Every lead pointed back to one name: Osama bin Laden. But here's what's crazy. Even after these attacks, most Americans still didn't know who Osama was. He was still operating in the shadows, still seen as a regional threat rather than a global one. The US response was swift but ultimately ineffective. President Clinton authorized cruise missile strikes on Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan that was suspected of producing chemical weapons for terrorists. The Afghanistan strikes mostly hit empty camps. Osama had been tipped off and evacuated beforehand. The Sudan strike turned out to be based on faulty intelligence. The factory was actually producing legitimate pharmaceuticals. It was like an action movie where the good guys look competent but keep missing the villain. But the most significant consequence of these retaliatory strikes wasn't military, it was psychological. For Osama and his followers, the fact that the world's most powerful military had tried and failed to kill him was proof that God was on their side. It was a massive propaganda victory that helped with recruitment and fundraising. Meanwhile, Osama was already planning his next move. The embassy bombings had been a proof of concept, demonstration that his organization could carry out complex, coordinated attacks against American targets. But he was thinking even bigger. The next attack came on October 12, 2000, against the USS Cole while it was refueling in Yemen. A small boat loaded with explosives rammed into the side of the destroyer, killing 17 sailors and nearly sinking one of the US Navy's most advanced warships. Again, the attack showed sophisticated planning and operational capability. The attackers had conducted surveillance for months, established safe houses, and coordinated with local contacts. This wasn't some improvised assault. This was military-level operational planning. But even after the Cole attack, the full scope of what Osama was planning remained hidden. Intelligence agencies knew he was dangerous, knew he was planning more attacks, but they were thinking in terms of embassies and military targets abroad. Nobody was thinking about commercial aviation. Nobody was thinking about the American homeland. Nobody was imagining that this Saudi millionaire hiding in Afghan caves was planning the most audacious terrorist attack in human history. September 11, 2001. I almost don't need to set the scene because everyone knows where they were when it happened. But what most people don't realize is how long Osama had been planning this attack, how many moving pieces had to come together, and how close it came to being even worse than it was. The planning for 9/11 began in the mid-1990s, which means Osama was thinking about this attack while most Americans had never even heard his name. The original concept came from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational mastermind, who approached Osama with the idea of using commercial aircraft as weapons. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. The original plan was even more ambitious. They were thinking about hijacking 10 planes simultaneously, attacking targets on both coasts, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed even wanted to pilot one of the planes himself. Osama, showing unusual restraint for a terrorist mastermind, scaled it back to 4 planes and selected the targets: the World Trade Center towers, representing American economic power, the Pentagon, representing military power, and either the Capitol or the White House, representing political power.
The recruitment and training process took years. They needed pilots who could learn to fly commercial aircraft, operatives who could blend into American society, and a financial network that could move money without being detected.
What's particularly chilling is how ordinary the hijackers seemed. They lived in American communities, shopped at American stores, went to American gyms. Muhammad Atta, the lead hijacker, was getting a master's degree in urban planning. These weren't wild-eyed fanatics living in caves. They were educated, middle-class men who had been radicalized and were capable of incredibly patient, long-term planning. The morning of September 11th, everything went according to plan. American Airlines Flight 11 hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. Only United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back, failed to reach its intended target. The immediate death toll was staggering. 2,977 people killed, including citizens from 90 different countries. But the broader impact was even more profound. This wasn't just an attack on America, it was an attack on the entire post-Cold War global order. And somewhere in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden was watching the coverage on television, probably amazed that his plan had worked even better than he had hoped. The towers didn't just collapse, they fell in a way that created maximum visual and psychological impact. The Pentagon, the symbol of American military might, was burning. Air traffic across the entire United States was grounded. The stock market was closed. The government was evacuated. For a few hours on September 11th, 19 men with box cutters had brought the world's most powerful country to a standstill. But Osama had also just guaranteed his own destruction. By attacking the American homeland and killing thousands of civilians, he had crossed a line that made compromise impossible and retaliation inevitable. September 20, 2001. President Bush stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered an ultimatum that would define the next decade. Tonight, the United States of America makes the following demands. On the Taliban. Deliver to United States authorities all the leaders of Al-Qaeda who hide in your land. The Taliban's response was essentially, how about no? And just like that, Osama bin Laden had triggered the longest war in American history. Operation Enduring Freedom began on October 7, 2001, with the largest bombing campaign since the Gulf War. But this wasn't just about destroying training camps or military targets. This was about removing the entire Taliban government and hunting down every member of Al-Qaeda. For Osama, who had spent years carefully building his network and establishing Afghanistan as his base of operations, the sudden arrival of American B-52s and Special Forces teams was like having your entire business model destroyed overnight. But here's the thing about Osama. He had always been a planner, always thinking several moves ahead. He had prepared for this possibility. As American forces closed in on Al-Qaeda's stronghold in the Tora Bora Mountains, Osama implemented an escape plan that he had probably been working on for years. The cave systems of Tora Bora weren't just hiding places. They were a fortress complex with multiple escape routes, supply caches, and communication systems. The Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001 was supposed to be the end of the story. American forces, supported by local Afghan allies, had cornered Osama and his remaining followers in a mountainous region along the Pakistan border. Airstrikes pounded the cave systems day and night. Ground forces sealed off escape routes. But when the smoke cleared, Osama was gone. How? The details are still debated, but it seems like a combination of factors. The difficult terrain made a complete seal impossible.
Local Afghan forces may have been more interested in capturing bounties than preventing escapes, and Pakistani border security was either incompetent or complicit. Whatever the exact mechanism, Osama bin Laden had vanished into the mountainous border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, beginning a manhunt that would consume American intelligence agencies for the next decade. But disappearing physically didn't mean disappearing from the global stage. Even in hiding, Osama continued to release audio and video messages, taunting his pursuers and calling for more attacks against Western targets. These messages served multiple purposes. They proved he was still alive, they maintained his relevance in the global media, they provided guidance to Al-Qaeda affiliates around the world, and they kept recruiting new followers to the cause. The weird thing is that even though everyone knew Osama was the world's most wanted man, even though there was a $25 million bounty on his head, even though the most advanced military and intelligence apparatus in human history was hunting him, he managed to stay hidden for almost 10 years. Think about that. In an age of satellite surveillance, electronic communications monitoring, and global intelligence sharing, one man managed to disappear completely while still running a global terrorist network. For nearly a decade after 9/11, Osama bin Laden became like a ghost. Everyone knew he existed, but nobody could find him. He had gone from being the world's most famous terrorist to being the world's most famous missing person. But just because he was hidden didn't mean he was inactive. Intelligence agencies were tracking a steady stream of communications and financial transactions that suggested Al-Qaeda was not just surviving, but evolving. The organization that Osama had created was proving to be remarkably resilient. Instead of a traditional hierarchical structure that would collapse if you removed the leader, Al-Qaeda had developed more of a network model, semi-independent cells that could operate with minimal central coordination.
This meant that even though Osama was in hiding, Al-Qaeda-inspired attacks continued around the world. The Madrid train bombings in 2004, the London transit attacks in 2005, and dozens of smaller operations across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. But where was Osama himself? The theories were endless. Hiding in the tribal areas of Pakistan, living in Iran under government protection, hiding in plain sight in a major city, or dead from kidney disease. There were persistent rumors about his health. What we now know is that he was living in a custom-built compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a military town about 35 miles from the capital, Islamabad. The compound was literally walking distance from Pakistan's premier military academy, which is like hiding next to West Point. For years, this tall, distinctive-looking man, who was supposedly the world's most wanted person, was living in suburban Pakistan, probably ordering groceries and complaining about the Wi-Fi like any other middle-aged guy. The compound itself was fascinating from an operational security perspective. No internet connection, no phone lines, all communications conducted through human couriers, high walls with no windows facing out, and careful procedures to avoid any electronic signatures that might be detected by surveillance. It was like a real-life version of a spy thriller, except it was actually happening. Meanwhile, the hunt for Osama had become a massive bureaucratic enterprise. The CIA had an entire unit dedicated to finding him. The military had special operations teams on constant standby, and intelligence agencies around the world were contributing resources to the search. But the breakthrough, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. In 2010, intelligence analysts identified one of Osama's couriers and began tracking his movements. The courier led them to the Abbottabad compound, and surveillance revealed that someone matching Osama's physical description was living there. Still, even at this point, they weren't 100% certain. The man they were watching was always careful to avoid being clearly seen from above, and his identity couldn't be confirmed through technical means because of the compound's communication security. This led to one of the most fascinating debates in modern intelligence history. How certain do you need to be before you order a military operation that could kill the world's most wanted terrorist or could accidentally kill some random Pakistani family? May 2nd, 2011. While most Americans were either sleeping or watching Sunday night television, a team of Navy SEALs was flying into Pakistan in modified Black Hawk helicopters for what would become the most famous military operation of the 21st century. The operation, codenamed Neptune Spear, was the culmination of years of intelligence work, months of planning, and weeks of preparation. But it was also incredibly risky. If something went wrong, it could trigger a diplomatic crisis with Pakistan or result in the loss of highly trained special forces operators. President Obama had been presented with several options: bomb the compound from the air, which would destroy any evidence, launch a joint operation with Pakistani forces, which risked leaks, or conduct a unilateral raid, which risked diplomatic fallout. He chose the raid, and at approximately 1 a.m. local time, the SEALs descended into the compound. What happened next has been the subject of countless books, movies, and investigations, but the basic facts are clear. The SEALs systematically cleared the compound, encountered sporadic resistance, and found Osama bin Laden on the 3rd floor of the main building. The man who had been the world's most wanted terrorist for over a decade was killed in a brief firefight that lasted less than a minute. But here's what's particularly striking about the end of Osama's story. When the SEALs searched his compound, they found that he had been living a relatively mundane existence. He was watching videos of himself on television, writing letters to his family, and trying to manage his scattered organization through a handful of trusted couriers. The fearsome terrorist mastermind had become an isolated old man, cut off from the world, dependent on others for basic information, and increasingly irrelevant to the organization he had founded. The immediate aftermath of his death was surreal. Within hours, crowds were gathering outside the White House chanting "USA, USA," while intelligence agencies around the world were scrambling to assess what this meant for global terrorism. But the broader impact of Osama's death was more complicated than people expected. Al-Qaeda didn't collapse. It had already evolved beyond dependence on any single leader. New terrorist organizations like ISIS would soon emerge that were even more brutal and extreme than Al-Qaeda. In many ways, Osama's death marked not the end of the global terrorism threat, but the end of a particular chapter in that story. So, what do we make of Osama bin Laden's story? How do we understand a man who went from a privileged millionaire's son to the most wanted terrorist in history? The simple narrative is that this was a story about religious extremism, but that misses a lot of the complexity. Osama's radicalization was shaped by personal grievances, political events, family dynamics, cultural conflicts, and individual psychology in ways that are difficult to untangle. His story is also a case study in how individual actions can have massive historical consequences. The decisions made by one man to go to Afghanistan in the 1980s, to form Al-Qaeda, to plan 9/11, literally changed the course of world history.
The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the expansion of surveillance programs, the changes in airline security, the rise of Islamophobia, the transformation of American foreign policy. All of these can be traced back to the actions of Osama bin Laden and the 19 hijackers who followed his orders. But perhaps the most important lesson from Osama's story is how dangerous it can be when someone combines radical ideology with operational capability, financial resources, and international networks. He wasn't just an angry extremist. He was an angry extremist with the skills and resources to act on his beliefs on a global scale. Today, more than a decade after his death, we're still dealing with the consequences of his actions. Terrorist organizations inspired by his ideology continue to operate around the world.
and the global security measures implemented in response to his attacks have become a permanent part of modern life. In the end, Osama bin Laden's story is a reminder that history is often shaped by individuals we might prefer to forget, and that understanding even the most despicable figures can help us better prepare for the challenges they leave behind. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical content, and let me know in the comments what historical figure should we cover next.